Hey troops, this is Jeff Evely, Ops Sgt-Maj for Veterans for Freedom. I'm back with you now. I have with me James Formosa. James is a retired captain, just recently released from the Canadian Armed Forces under Article 5F, which is no longer suitable for service. That's basically what's tantamount to being fired in the Canadian Armed Forces. And of course, we see a lot of that going on these days with people like James on account of their exercising their own bodily autonomy. And James comes to us with a really good background for what we're doing here. He has an undergrad with philosophy and history and a master's in philosophy. And, if I haven't said this before on this podcast, I'll say it now. I really see that as being key to our success in this crisis. I think that what the world really needs is more philosophy. And so James has some interesting topics that he's picked out here today. Before I show you our first video here, I thought maybe I'd let him introduce the topic and tell us a little bit about what brings him to Veterans for Freedom. James, go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. Yes, so I served in the Canadian Armed Forces from April 2017 until July 2022, always maintaining, as you mentioned, the necessity of our rights to our bodily autonomy, and submitted an exemption request, which was, of course, denied by my chain of command. At this time, I'm still in the final stages of the grievance process to grieve the answer for them denying my accommodation request. But as you mentioned, it's good to have this discussion here today about Yuri Bezmenov and the 4 stages of Soviet subversion. As you mentioned, in my background, before I joined the military, I obtained a Bachelor of Arts double majoring in history and philosophy. And in my history degree, I like to spend a significant amount of time studying the history of the Soviet Union. And then after I got my Bachelor of Arts, I then pursued a Master of Arts in philosophy, specializing in ethics, which I did believe made me uniquely suited for my follow-on career with the military. That being said, I wanted to leverage my education and provide the value that I had obtained from it to pass it on or pay it forward to my troops. So towards the end of my career, as a troop commander in the artillery, I was responsible for the weekly training schedule with my troops. And one of the things I decided to do was, well, first of all, being a, dare I say it, a true believer in what we signed up for and in preparing our soldiers for the very real challenges and tasks of our day, I thought it absolutely vital and necessary that I teach them about who Yuri Bezmenov was, what kind of information he actually gave to Canadian society after he defected from the KGB and was granted asylum by Pierre Trudeau back in the 80s. And so I developed a slideshow presentation that I delivered to a couple different batteries as I was moving through my regiment to teach my soldiers about how, essentially from the KGB's own handbook, this defected agent had provided to us the tools that they were using and that various communist and Marxist organizations were using to subvert Western democratic societies and cultures from within, mainly by corrupting all of their institutions. And perhaps the most shocking aspect of this, of course, is it's still available. There's a lot of interviews from him still up on YouTube, circa, I want to say, 1986. And at the time that he was giving this information to the Canadian public, I think even on CBC at the time, he had already cautioned folks that these efforts that he called things like demoralization and subversion had already been not only well underway, but almost entirely completed by the time he was actually telling this to the public. So it's a very long process, as we'll see when we go through this, that it's something that takes 1 to 2, if not multiple generations worth of time in a society to reap the benefits of what they're trying to accomplish. But by his own warning, since he said that at his time in the 80s that the demoralization stage was already well on its way, if not complete, that much more egregious changes and upheavals in society were going to be soon to follow as a result of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been interested in this topic for quite a while, so I'm really glad that we have a chance to talk about it here on the podcast. I don't want to be patting myself on the back too hard, but I've kind of been saying like we're going in the wrong direction since 2010. I can remember saying things like political correctness is the new speak that Orwell warned us about. And everybody's been calling me a crackpot since like 2010. So it's really interesting to be where I am right now. And I recall just within the last couple of years, they came out with a new Call of Duty, and all the buzz sort of in my online circles around then was about the opening cinematic that included a clip from Yuri Bezmenov. So everybody was kind of saying like, wow, they're mainstreaming this guy now. This was kind of something that we were just sort of talking about, but it seems like maybe there's a little bit more awareness growing right now, showing up in the culture, which is I think a positive development, that kind of awareness showing up in the culture like that. So without further ado, I thought maybe we just start everybody off with a little clip from Yuri Bezmenov here, just so anybody who's not familiar with him can get a flavor for what it is exactly that we're talking about. So I'm just going to give you guys a share screen, and I'll forego my usual first try without the audio. And we'll just do it with the audio. Here he is. Ideological subversion.
Ideological subversion is the process which is legitimate, overt, and open. You can see it with your own eyes. All you have to do, all American mass media has to do, is to unplug their bananas from their ears, open up their eyes, and they can see it. There is no mystery. There is nothing to do with espionage. I know that espionage intelligence gathering looks more romantic. It sells more deodorants through the advertising, probably. That's why your Hollywood producers are so crazy about James Bond type of thrillers. But in reality, the main emphasis of the KGB is not in the area of intelligence at all. According to my opinion and opinion of many defectors of my caliber, only about 15% of time, money, and manpower is spent on espionage as such. The other 85% is a slow process which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. It's a great brainwashing process which goes very slow, and it's divided in 4 basic stages. The first one being demoralization. It takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. Why that many years? Because this is the minimum number of years which requires to educate one generation of students in the country of your enemy, exposed to the ideology of the enemy. In other words, Marxism-Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students without being challenged or counterbalanced by the basic values of Americanism, American patriotism. The result you can see, most of the people who graduated in the 60s, dropouts or half-baked intellectuals, are now occupying the positions of power in the government, civil service, business, mass media, educational system. You are stuck with them. You cannot get rid of them. They are contaminated. They are programmed to think and react to certain stimuli in a certain pattern. You cannot change their mind, even if you expose them to authentic information, even if you prove that white is white and black is black, you still cannot change the basic perception and the logic of behavior. In other words, these people, the process of demoralization is complete and irreversible. To get rid society of these people, you need another 20 or 15 years to educate a new generation of patriotically minded and common sense people who would be acting in favor and in the interests of the United States society.
And yet these people who've been put.
Okay, I think that's kind of the main gist that I wanted to put out there for everybody. So he's talking about cultural subversion and kind of focusing on that first stage of demoralization. He said there's 4 stages, and the first one is demoralization. And the process takes 15 to 20 years because that's how long it takes to educate a generation of children, in this case, American children. And what he's saying is they're basically injecting soft Marxism into the education system so that the generation educated in that system will reach a point of demoralization where it's not possible, basically, to reason with them from the sounds of it. Is that about a fair characterization, James?
Absolutely. And I think it's important, too, that he mentioned there in that clip that by succeeding to such a degree of demoralization like that, you've prevented people from being able to hear the truth or to be persuaded by factual based evidence or information, but also in a certain very pernicious sense, it turns people to a way where they are incapable of rationalizing or thinking about whatever appropriate steps or measures are necessary in their own best interest or the interest of their loved ones and their families and then their communities, and then ultimately it expands out to their nation.
Right. I've heard it said that the Eastern mind is quite different from the Western mind. I think I heard Dan Crenshaw, he's a congressman in the United States, ex-Navy SEAL, and a Stoic, who was talking about that recently. And he was using the example of a female Russian friend of his who made the case that, they don't appreciate things in the West. They don't have the classics in the West. They don't have something like that. And he said, well, what are you talking about? You can get all the classics on Amazon for like $10 a paperback. And she would say something like, well, yeah, but, it's just a paperback and it just comes from Amazon, in Russia, like these are very rare works, and they're all leather bound. And so it's a real classic and you get that real appreciation for it. And so to us, like that seems backward. And I think basically it's kind of like, in Enlightenment rationalism, like we're guided by a kind of empirical yardstick that's common to everybody, and it's about methods of determining truth. But in the East, I think the mind is more persuaded towards whatever serves the regime is true. So I just thought maybe I'd bounce that idea off you. It's something I've been playing with. What do you think of that?
Well, and it does certainly seem like, as this process, we would argue, has been extremely effective in our own society, we are very clearly, to most people, even if they don't have a background or a strong understanding of or knowledge of this stuff, as I mentioned to you before we came live here, all it really takes is a common sense sort of approach for people to look back on their own lives and for the past 20 years or more to perceive the changes in our own society, to see how we're actually beginning to be more reflective of that Eastern model, as you say. Right. It's interesting as well that you mentioned how you were sort of ringing the alarm bells back in 2010, and it perfectly lined up for me as well, of course, because when I was going through my post-secondary education, for me, I was in undergrad and graduate school from 2010 to 2015, which I would again argue in the whole historical context of all of this was a perfect time to also bear witness to what I would call the tactics and tools of subversion being dialed up to 11, because it certainly was not as bad in 2010 as I perceived as I was leaving in 2015. But I noticed the frog in the boiling pot analogy, the gradual raising of the temperature to get the students of my generation to conform to this new way of thinking. And the most common one was actually, of course, being a liberal arts major, of course, across all of the disciplines. It didn't matter if it was philosophy or history, or I took a few electives as well in English and sociology, anthropology. Across all of these liberal arts disciplines, as I got about midway through my education and then towards the end, I would say the spread was leaning towards anywhere from 40% or higher of the professors being openly avowed Marxists. And one of the common through lines, especially in philosophy departments, in terms of a way of thinking that they wanted to impress upon their students, was an undermining of the ideas we have about reality being objective.
Right.
The constant subjectivism of phrases that did not exist in our common speaking with one another just a few years ago. We didn't used to talk about your truth versus my truth, and what's true for you might not be true for me. There was just what was true regardless of how you felt about it.
Yeah, and get over yourself.
Right.
Yeah, and I think we understood, like, at least when I was growing up, when people would be invocative of their emotions to justify a certain course of action, it was always we would always fire back with something like, well, whose feelings are the ones that really matter? Whose feelings are true? Because we all understood that the answer was the dictator. And somewhere along the line, we seem to have lost sight of that. But I thought, that's a good way to start us off there. And James, he's put together this presentation for us, and I think this is emblematic of what you were doing with your troops in the military as well, James. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm going to hand this over to him, and we'll see what he's got to say there, and hopefully I can throw in a few questions at the end. So stick around and feel free to fire your questions in the comments there, and hopefully we'll get to them. So here we go, James. Take it away.
So we can just roll it back there to the first slide.
Oh, geez. My bad. I'll take that back out.
So for everybody watching as well, this slide deck that I'm showing here now is actually the exact same one that I gave to my troops, because as a troop commander, I was responsible for developing the weekly training schedule, and I wanted to make sure that my troops were being given not just the regular everyday training, like, of course, you got to know how to shoot your rifle and do the business of your specific trade, but I, of course, strongly believed in intellectually equipping my soldiers to be able to deal in this new and emerging environment that we were in, which is one of fourth generational or psychological warfare. So I gave them this presentation, and it went as follows. So I started off by telling them that I was going to run through the 4 stages of subversion. Next slide. So the main teaching points, or MTPs, that I would give them is a bit of a background on who Yuri Bezmenov is, and then go through the 4 stages as he described in great detail during his media appearances and his written works back in the 80s. So that includes the 4 stages are demoralization, destabilization, crisis, and normalization. Next slide, please. We saw this or something similar in the last clip, but as Yuri Bezmenov explained it, he said that ideological subversion or psychological warfare changes the perception of reality in those that are affected to such an extent that despite an abundance of information, no one is able to come to a sensible conclusion in the interest of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. And as I was going through a lot of these examples, or just giving the broad strokes or the bigger picture of what this process is, as explained by Yuri Bezmenov, I didn't spend a lot of time with my troops in those classes going over specific examples from our society, because I was so confident in their own ability to be rational and exercise common sense that I just prefaced this presentation by telling my soldiers, just think about your own lived experiences as a citizen of Canadian society over the last 20 years of your life, from your early childhood till your time now in this institution. Think about the way your perceived reality has changed according to the examples I'm about to give. So let's go right ahead into the first step. As was mentioned in that clip from Yuri Bezmenov, demoralization, the first stage, is a generational process. He said 15 to 20 years. In some other written works, he said it could take as long as 30 years for this process to be absolutely completed. And this is what's needing to happen at a very big picture macro scale. So to demoralize a society, you have to begin by subverting some of the biggest ideas or the foundational undergirding principles of a society. So you're subverting that society's history and tradition with regards to their religious institutions, institutions of education, the media, and then just broad strokes, other aspects of their cultures. The way that Yuri Bezmenov saw them to do this, of course, is to politicize and to commercialize entertainment, encourage this idea of, again, permissiveness and relativity, especially moral relativity and moral relativism, a thing that happened a lot of times as well in the educational institutions here in Canada, often especially championed in the sciences of the social sciences of anthropology and sociology, is this idea of ethnocentrism, or in other words, at running the risk of being ethnocentric, we better not make any moral judgments or claims whatsoever about any other cultures or their values or their way of doing business, because who are you, who are we to judge these other people for the simple fact that we weren't born there?
Cultural relativism?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they would also, of course, intend to monopolize, manipulate, and discredit, shift the focus of society itself onto non-issues. In other words, have everybody be preoccupied and arguing amongst themselves over things that in the big picture don't really matter, but are a great way to keep people occupied and fighting amongst themselves rather than dealing with the more higher order institutional problems that are already underway.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing, of course, to do here, as it says, is to promote false heroes and role models. So in your media and all your other institutions, make sure that everybody's attention is drawn on especially certain celebrity figures who, just by a cursory examination of their own lives or their own behavior, you can see that this is not somebody that you would really want to look up to, but they're rich and famous and therefore automatically noteworthy and worth emulating. And the result of being successful in this demoralization procedure is that you promote a sort of societal death wish. It's very disturbing to see this lived out, but there's a very poignant example in our own society here where, by people's own lived bodily and verbalized behaviors, they seem to wish for their own demise. There's a widespread swath of ignorance, uninformed myopia in the masses, and there are very addictive fads which are often entirely coinciding and tied up in virtue signaling. So you've replaced again, just like if there's a historical or a homogenous value or religious moral tradition in a society, you replace that tradition with some kind of very visible and vocal or outward signal to show how virtuous you are. But the only way that you actually have a measuring yardstick to that is, my virtue is exactly tied to how well I am able to conform with what the government or the ruling class is telling me how to do or think or behave. That's what makes me a good person, rather than my commitment to these higher order values. I would also say that when it comes to this, the demoralization, it also attacks the structures of society. As you see in there, they have to assault even the conceptions of law and order, people's trust in those institutions, the breakdown of social relations, so you're not able to have what we might consider, and now through rosy-colored glasses, a common sense neighborly atmosphere amongst your neighbors, even if you don't know them, just because you're all citizens of the same nation. It's also, of course, intending to break down and trivialize or ruin certain relationships when it comes to internal politics between various political parties and their ability to work with each other, even if they happen to have policy or ideological disagreements, and as well, of course, ruin our relations with other countries that would be less demoralized than we are. The main methods that they use, as it says here, to attack, to demoralize the structure of our society is when law becomes legislative and not moral. In other words, when we might look to traditional views of laws, laws were tied up with some sense of morality that relies again on certain conceptions about the sacred nature of the individual and our responsibility towards one another. And instead, law becomes very, like it says, legalized. It's all about how good you or I am at following the letter of the law, just because this is what is written by those in power. Another thing that's very common is is a championing of this idea of the supremacy of rights over obligations. And this is a very pernicious thing, of course, because you can see it as a sort of, it is a good thing, of course, to champion human rights and to say, you know, I have a right to something, you have a right, we all have these rights. That's not a bad thing in and of itself. But when that becomes the primary driving focus, the intention behind that is to, in a certain real sense, make the society forget that along with rights, there comes responsibilities, and that you have certain moral duties towards your fellow citizens in terms of how you ought to treat them. Of course, it needs to undermine intelligence organizations, the police, and the military itself, reinforce antagonisms between political parties. I mean, it's not a big surprise that there will be certain levels of antagonism between parties that differ in terms of their platforms and their goals and ideas, but it's meant to dial that sort of thing, of course, way up past 11, and as well sabotage present and future positive relationships between allied nations, like I mentioned in the foreign relations piece. Now, the result of doing all of this, as it says there, is that it encourages a fundamental mistrust of justice itself as a concept, as well as our justice system, and to remove personal responsibility from the hierarchy of social values. Meaning, of course, that the primary focus or the care of the newer emerging generations in the culture is instant gratification, hedonism, what the government is responsible for taking care of me in a certain sense, and it's all about what I'm supposed to be owed or deserving and getting, with no focus on how that also should be flipped the other way and think about what my obligations are to other people. And as a result of doing this, it leads to a pervading sense of defenselessness, disunity, and isolation between all of the now more fully atomized individuals in an institution. Now, as this process continues forward, you get to a stage now where you're trying to, as these agents of demoralization affect the life and the very personal lives themselves of all the people involved. So in this case, you need to subvert ideas about family and society, about public health, ideas of race, population, and labor. A very big chief one amongst this, of course, is the breakdown of nuclear families as a social unit, because historically speaking, we can see how the unity that comes from blood ties of family relations is really hard to defeat or fight against. But if you can destroy the nuclear family, then the only pervading allegiance that people will feel very strongly about, in this case, would be your allegiance to the state. Another important aspect of this, of course, is, as it says there in scare quotes, appealing to experts, and these are usually people with no reasonable actual expertise, to inform public health while promoting at the same time overindulgence and hedonism, which leads to people's early demise. As well, you have the reframing of all societal institutions in terms of power. That is, there is no way to understand any interactions between any other people in society except through this lens of one of you is the oppressor and the other one is the oppressed, and it's always an eternal struggle for power. And in that kind of a conception, there can be no provisions for things that we would all kind of consider to be morally praiseworthy, like grace and mercy and genuine altruism between neighbors. Another big aspect of this, of course, to break down people's ability to behave in a rugged individualistic sense, is to de-land the citizenry while promoting urbanization. Another thing that this, of course, helps for the state is that if you've taken away land ownership from the people themselves and pushed them all into the growing larger megacities, it's a lot easier to maintain a massive grid of state-sponsored surveillance among the people, because they're all kept in one large concrete zoo.
Yeah.
And of course, then you encourage animosity between labor unions and society at large to further break down the relationships between workers and their employers. Now, as I was mentioning all earlier in that slide, by doing all of this and becoming successful, the result is that there are no personal loyalties in the traditional senses as we would understand them. The only loyalties left remaining in that sort of power vacuum then is your loyalty to the state or big brother. And it, of course, encourages enfeebled masses, hatred and division amongst, again, these increasingly atomized and separated individuals, and a ongoing rolling tidal wave of alienation and victimization and re-victimization through the generations as people are further and further affected by this process. Now, once this stage has been effective and fully taken hold in society, Bezmenov said that this would reach a period of destabilization, which, after laying that very long suffering groundwork, destabilization should be able to be completed in a much quicker fashion. Here it says it could take only 2 to 5 years to complete. This is where you are reaching that stage of near total subversion. So it's resulting in these power struggles amongst the economy itself, the societal fiber, things holding us together in our old traditional institutions, our conceptions of the rule of law itself, and there's increasing foreign influence from seeming all directions. The methods they will use for this period, when it's a lot more, when everything has been essentially pushed to the extreme, is that there's going to be an increase in populism, both from people that are trying to resist these things that they're starting to notice, but also using grassroots and populist movements and subverting them from within so that they can be used for their ill purposes. So there's irresponsible power struggles amongst these groups rather than unifying against this common enemy, let's say. It leads to a destruction of the bargaining process, as I mentioned earlier, between the employees and their employers, encouraging grassroots participation once again. But the key and the focus there, of course, is to make sure that grassroots participation is always focused towards the wrong thing. Or, as I mentioned a few slides back, the focus needs to always be shifted towards non-issues that don't really matter. And this will increase the sense of isolationism. The results of this, of course, is an acceptance and a yielding to Big Brother as the seeming only consistent or steadfast thing to look to. As a totally victimized and alienated person, the only sense of comfort or stability is now coming from the state or Big Brother. It'll lead to that idea of mobocracy, where you will have radicalized groups that are shouting from the rooftops or very angrily engaging with other people in public, and leading to that kind of torch and pitchfork rule that we're beginning to see. And as all of this is happening and the country is becoming so weakened from within that it's blatantly obvious to all these other actors on the outside that the belligerent encirclement by foreign elements that all want a slice of the pie, so to speak, begins to start kicking off at a very rapid pace. Now, assuming that all of this is as successful as these bad faith actors want it to be, Bezmenov warned that this would inevitably lead to a period of crisis, or stage 3. And this would be a rapid revolution within the society that might only take 2 to 6 months. And he warned back again in Canada on CBC back in 1986 that this would be a point of no return, where a cataclysmic event would upset and divide a country, thereby creating panic among the citizens. In his estimation, to Americans, symptoms would include circumventing the Constitution and altering the checks and balances of government and possibly martial law. The result of this, of course, being chaos and the collapse of all previous societal order, and the acceptance of the next stage in this process as the only conceivable solution to the present crisis.
Watch for that.
So once you've been successful at all of these horrific actions, you finally reach the end goal for them, the stage of normalization. So you've totally subverted all of the previous cultural, societal, moral, and legal institutions in a country. The common way this would be described for people is every single individual in the society has no way of recognizing where they live anymore. If they had to compare it to before this process began, the country that they already live in is completely unrecognizable at every possible scale of resolution. And once this has been so effective and so disastrous in all of these various different ways and areas of the society, you will reach a point where people, in the interest of their very survival itself, this could literally mean things like manufactured famines and energy crises, that the only way through it, of course, the convenient solution that is then offered by Big Brother or the state, is the acceptance of a new order. In this case, it would be a form of communism. So this was the clip that was in the clip we started out with. And but again, for the audience, keep in mind, he was warning that this Marxist ideology was being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students. So he was warning since basically after the Second World War, it had already been kicking off. And it was not being challenged or counterbalanced by traditional American values in any of those institutions. It was running roughshod over everything. And most of the people then, by his estimation, that had graduated in the 60s, then by the mid-80s, were occupying all the positions of power in the government, civil service, business, mass media, and the education system. And because of this, they were programmed to think and react only to the appropriate stimuli and appropriate patterns according to this plan. And when it becomes as effective as this is, these people, if they are completely and fully subverted or demoralized, you cannot change their mind, even if you expose them to blatantly authentic, factual, undeniable information. It's just simply not possible to psychologically get through to these people. Mm-hmm. And now this picture, I just ended this for my troops, this statue, because at the time I was giving these lectures now almost 6 or so months ago. I wanted to show this to them as I ended my talk by saying this is a statue of what was called the new Soviet man and the new Soviet woman from the Stalinist era in the early mid-50s in Russia. The reason being is because this was a state-sponsored propaganda tactic where they're trying to enforce certain behaviors in their citizenry. So they came out with a description of the kind of person you're supposed to be the new, bold, wonderful Soviet man and woman of the working world. And this is how you're supposed to think and believe and act. And the interesting fact about all of this is that their conception of the new Soviet man and the new Soviet woman was all tied together under a political platform that was called by the Soviets at the time the new normal. And the whole process, of course, was to get their citizenry to accept their version of the new normal.
Wow. It's pretty incredible stuff there, James. You really hit on kind of essentially all of the parallels, I think, that we're seeing in our society today. I got a couple of questions in the chats here, but I thought maybe the first one we could start with. Which stage would you say we're at right now of ideological subversion?
Well, keep in mind, I think, of course, Bezmenov was much more of an expert on this than I am, but he cautioned the American people and the Canadian people as well, I guess. He had said by 1985, 86, that he already believed that the demoralization stage was already complete by then. I think, again, in terms of now that we have the benefit, though, of looking back with hindsight in 2020 of the benefit of history, the destabilization process may have taken longer to complete. And I would have to say, as far as I can tell, it seems like we are still, to my estimation, near the end stages of that destabilization process. There's still things like, don't get me wrong, everybody can see it for themselves, how the world in general, and especially Western democratic societies, have been thoroughly destabilized, especially in the last 2 years on various different scales of resolution. But perhaps the good news for us is that we still have not yet reached the point of crisis. This is just saying many people would still probably want to say, well, the last 2 years in particular seems like quite a crisis. And there are certainly tons of problems with what's been happening. But when we come to what we mean by a crisis, it's something that unfortunately is far worse than anything we've already even begun to see in the last 2 years. But my concern, of course, with all of this, and why I feel like it's so relevant to tell this audience as well as my troops while I was still in the Army, was to warn them that the crisis is very soon to come, and it's going to be to such a disastrous degree that people will be beset with a very serious choice. And the choice would be, I have $20 left in my pocket. That's all the money I have to my name. And my choice is between, do I use that for natural gas to heat my home to stay from freezing to death? Or do I use it to buy food so I don't starve to death? or do I use it to put gas in my car to be able to go to work, to make enough money to just, again, barely keep myself from starving, and probably still not accomplish that. And as we've been seeing with some of the most recent moves, globally speaking, as well as here locally, we are very quickly approaching, within this year, stages where there will be a crisis, not only in our own country, but in many other Western countries, where the citizens themselves have to make hard choices for their own basic needs of survival.
Yeah, and I think that the push toward urbanization is basically a kind of compounding factor in all of that. It creates dependencies. Like once you're in the city, you know, going out and hunting for your food is not exactly an option. Growing food in your yard is not exactly an option. You're more dependent on state assets and modern technologies to survive there. So when things go south, like, and they're not working, then you know, there are no other options but for a savior to come in and help you, right? So I think that the urbanization is part of making us vulnerable to that kind of thing. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And there's various aspects where you can see this sort of thing happening, where under the guise, and this is the most pernicious aspect of a lot of these moves that are being made, is that the way that the powers that be, let's say, are trying to make something more palatable is that they will appeal to what we would both consider to be the better aspects of human nature, like our capacity for compassion towards one another, and our empathy
Right.
is one of the greatest things that we have as human beings.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also one of the most pernicious things. If you can twist that empathy and compassion towards the wrong focus or the wrong
Mm-hmm.
thing, you can very strongly motivate people to do things that are not in their own best interest, even for their survival. For instance, on the one hand, you may be concerned with the human impacts that we may have on the environment. However, it's better, I would argue, it's better to understand certain things, like the big push to not only get people to switch towards electric vehicles, or just not having personal vehicles altogether, as certain
Mm-hmm.
members like in the World Economic Forum would suggest. That's not meant to save the environment per se, but rather the real underlying goal for that is to place increasing restrictions and limits on human freedom. In that case, the big restriction would be on your freedom of movement,
Mm-hmm.
because that allows you to be more self-sufficient and self-sustaining, and to, quite literally in that case, especially in as large a country as ours, to move about this place and to, as we may end up having to do, find food to hunt, etc.
Yeah, and I guess I'll point out that electric cars and batteries in general don't produce any power. They only store it. They're still powered by coal, for the most part, and they take an awful lot of minerals to make them. And we probably have about 12 years of lithium left on the whole planet, from what I've heard. So it's not about the environment, folks. It's about manipulating all the best qualities about you, you know, and your desire to do good in the world, and basically sort of invert the paradigm, so that you think you're doing good when, in fact, you're just walking right into their traps and not even really saving the planet to begin with. I'm going to go to the comments here, James, so I don't hog up too much airtime on you here, but here's a good one. James, would you agree that the Marxist playbook would be at a similar stage to 1940 USA, in which we should be expecting the next turns into weed out fascists similar to 1950 USA? Sorry if I flubbed that.
It seems like this is some of a reference to like the McCarthyism era, and we had the Red Scare, where arguably you might say now it seems like McCarthy might have been right about quite a few things, and he sounding the alarm bells were important. But yes, as a sort of, again, this, like you just mentioned, this natural turn or this inversion of things away for the Marxists, or this super radical left-wing push will try to obscure what it's doing, or divert responsibility, or again, keep the focus of the people on something that is not as great of a threat as the real current greatest threat. It will, this is not to say that there isn't a problem or a threat for extreme right-wing ideologies or fascism or things of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
However, the way that they will attempt to distract us, and we're already beginning to see this sort of thing, is to, by shifting the Overton window, and slowly but surely our society is just going further and further left, to the point where what you might consider classical liberalism of just a couple decades ago is now the new extreme right-wing ideology, and
That's exactly
they will begin labeling things as extreme right or fascist when really it has no actual bearing or basis in that definition. And what's about to happen then, in order to promote further destabilization and maybe the crisis that leads to a collapse, is the labeling of large swaths of the population, common groups, as super alt-right wingers, fascists, Nazis. That the phrase will be thrown out quite a bit, and that's something that we have all very clearly seen to an extreme degree, and it was turned up that much more as a result of things like the convoy last January.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because I'm tracking another theory too, and I'll just kind of tease this along a little bit. But I heard Yuri Bezmenov say that, you know, the initial stage of demoralization has already been completed in the schools. Those kids that they were educating, like they graduated, he said, in the 60s. And so they're gone into the institutions and whatnot now, like so, and they're already in the institutions. They're working their way up the ladder. The long march through the institutions is already well underway at the time that he's giving this interview here. And I heard McCarthyism get thrown in there too, which I happen to think has kind of been hyped beyond the grasp of rational discourse at this point. And let's not forget that Alger Hiss actually did go to prison. Like there were communist subverters that were active in the United States. A lot of good people got chewed up in the process from the sounds of things. They were overzealous, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't a well-founded concern to begin with. I don't think anybody would dispute that at this point, as a matter of fact. But it's interesting to consider that, because what I'm always pointing out, what I'm always talking about, is this thing called Strauss-Howe generational theory, and it says we're in a fourth turning right now, which is a crisis era, started in 2008, and it's not due to end until 2026 to 2030. And basically the way it works is they forecasted we'd be going into this crisis in the year 2005, plus or minus 3 years, back in 1990, because that was the time at which they were expecting the boomer generation to be moving into peak institutional power. And then at that time, we got the minor crisis that kicks off the crisis era, which was the 2008 collapse, so 3 years after 2005. And they said that the major crisis that the crisis era culminates in would start in 2020, plus or minus 2 years. And, you know, then we had 2019, 2020 happen. So it seems to be tracking well, and it also tracks well with what Bezmenov is saying about a demoralized generation graduating in the 60s, because that would have been the boomer generation. And that is kind of what I'm seeing out there now. So I like to point this out, you know, like if we're looking at General Iyer of the military, you know, he's a boomer, and Brenda Lucky of the RCMP, boomer, the only chief of the Privy Council office, Michael Wernick, who's ever resigned in Canadian history. He's a boomer. And, you know, the list goes on, but that's just kind of a social lens that I like to throw in there. It's another one of these theories that I find is mapping very well to our current circumstances, probably the best. That's what I seem to think. And this is, I see this as being sort of a compounding factor, like, and this talk about like intergenerational warfare, a lot of the things that Sun Tzu talks about in The Art of War, there are very strong parallels with what Bezmenov is describing here. And I think that the plan and the 4 stages, it essentially maps with what they call a saeculum, or a great year. It's 4 generations long, and basically we just keep going into these crises every 4 generations, because there's only 4 generational archetypes, and the prophet archetype, when it reaches peak institutional power, and it's early elderhood, that's when we get into trouble, and that's the boomer generation. And it's always the case that it's the generation born in the wake of the last major crisis. So last one was the Second World War. The one before that was the American Civil War, and the one before that was the American Revolution. And they followed all the way back to the Old World and the Lutheran Reformation, and I could probably go much further than that. But anyway, it seems like it is part of a cycle. But I don't know if, there's been some cross-pollination in the East between the Russians and the Chinese, the way that they go about this cultural warfare, psychological warfare, where they turn everybody in the society against each other and the population against the state, to the point where nobody can actually cohere in a productive manner, and then they just kind of come in and be the savior, and that's the art of war, essentially. There's a lot of cavalry movements and stuff like that in there these days, but that's not why it's still relevant. But anyway, yeah, I just thought I'd throw that in there. And essentially the prophet generation prosecutes the new awakening, which happened 60s, 70s, with the hippie movement. And the new religion right now, the new theocracy, is postmodernism, according to the theory. So, and postmodernism, as you know, is Michel Foucault, the Jacques Derridas, the Herbert Marcuse, a couple others, the Frankfurt School types that were Marxists, came over from Germany, basically for the purpose of subverting the United States, I think, through the institution of academia. And it was Foucault that Ronald Reagan fired when he was governor of California for inciting the Berkeley riots. Again, that was the boomer generation. And really kind of what I'm seeing is it's sort of the same people. It's just that they went back into the institutions and they've gotten older, and through natural attrition and some work on their part, I'm sure, they're now aging into peak institutional power. But I don't think that the anti-Western, anti-capitalist agenda has changed very much. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's like they say, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it sure rhymes quite well as it goes through
Mark
the
Twain.
ages. Yeah, and as we're seeing, like you said there, with this idea of postmodernism just being a smokescreen for Marxism, for all of those German and French intellectuals, they even knew this, that they couldn't, in any sense of good conscience or reason, keep calling themselves open Marxists, at least not at that time in the 60s and 70s. And I think it was Dr. Jordan Peterson who was mentioning this, and it was precisely because the information from the Soviet Union, the truth about what it's really like to live in a Marxist society, was finally coming out, with things like Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago was finally being translated into English in the West.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, essentially what those folks all realized is, we still have a plan. There's still something we want to accomplish. We just need to find new words to describe exactly the same things that we want to have happen. And so, because that was so successful over the last few decades, and they've, in a certain sense, fully demoralized us, or gotten our younger generations fully steeped in being brought up and living under these things, it's been so effective that now, and with the benefit of people not having any kind of historical memory whatsoever, you're now beginning to see them coming full circle again, where it's almost as if they now have a certain sense of boldness with being able to again come out and openly say they're Marxist, or a way that I would describe it too when I was going through undergrad and grad school. You would be able to see students across the campus, the common thing, people wearing a Che Guevara shirt and they have no idea who the guy really is,
Right,
or
yeah.
they'd have communist hobby groups or clubs on the campuses, and people walking around my campus wearing a little pin on their jacket or their backpack with a hammer and sickle,
Mm-hmm.
which to my estimation, is similarly disturbing and horrific as if there were students walking around with a swastika pin on their backpack, which of course would not be acceptable. But
Mm-hmm.
why would we split hairs on mass murdering institutions that are destroying societies? The fact that they've normalized some of those, again, common phrases you hear, like, well, that wasn't real communism.
Right.
That sort of thing as a very
Right.
pithy and ill-informed way of dismissing extremely valid criticisms of the dangers of these ideologies.
And I want to point one thing out about that argument too. It's a logical fallacy. It's the no true Scotsman fallacy. So yeah, I mean, if you just look that up, like that's kind of a thing where they say, oh, that's not real communism, and oh, that's not real communism. And then if you look for an example of real communism, well, there isn't one. So it's a total fallacy. It's just a kind of an avoidance tactic, really, if you ask me, avoid engaging with the issues and engaging with the central point. So watch out for that, and that's a good tactic, I think, for everyday folks to adopt in the culture war at this stage, is to really stick to rigid logic, maybe get conversant with, like, half a dozen logical fallacies or something, and you'd be amazed at what a difference it makes in kind of everyday engagements and debates on the issues. But I have another comment here that I thought was interesting for both of us. It says, I ask, the military's oath is to the Constitution. It's obviously being broken. Why are they not acting? You want to try that one first?
Oh, that was a great question, and it's not an easy one to answer, because I've found myself asking the similar kinds of questions as I've gone through the process of being ousted from that very institution. And I would argue that from my own lived experience and from many others that I will hope soon join in on this conversation to describe how it was for them, that a lot of us took very seriously this kind of duty and responsibility we had. So it is shocking to see that it's not happening. And the reason why it's so concerning to all of us is that it's not happening in the places where it matters the most, or it's most needed. So in this case, it's not taking place in the positions of highest institutional power, like you mentioned before, with the Chief of Defense Staff.
Right.
He, by virtue of his position, if he were to be a man of integrity, he could stick to the values and principles, the code of ethics that we all swore to live by being a member of that institution, and say that I have a moral duty and a responsibility not only to do what's right, but also to say no when even if I'm being influenced from some external factor, to do something that I know violates my moral principles, my conscience, and the oath I swore to my country.
Yeah, and I know that to be a moral injury. Like I talked about that a little bit in a presentation I gave a long time ago. It's probably still up on YouTube on some of this stuff. And I was discussing the Somalia affair and the issue of Kyle Brown, who was the lone Gen Xer who gave us the photos that showed us what those guys were really up to over there. And the guy who bullied him into it was a boomer. And the boomer chain of command, of course, threw him under the bus and scapegoated him. And he was the only guy who actually went to prison over the whole thing for 5 years. He got a 5-year sentence. And he wrote a book called Scapegoat: How the Army Betrayed Kyle Brown. And the report on Somalia, they concluded that there was a careerist mentality in the Canadian Armed Forces brass at that time, and that they had a tendency to blame the lower ranks when things went wrong, and that they lied, profusely to the commission throughout the entire process. And the Defense Ethics Program basically resulted from that. They came out in 2003 with Duty with Honor, and then followed on with that with the Defense Ethics Program for all of the Department of National Defense in 2012. And I do think that that's a really good piece of doctrine that they have there with the Defense Ethics Statement. And the number one ethical principle is respect the dignity of all persons. And like you said, you have General Iyer there, who basically got the job, I think, by agreeing to impugn the dignity of the entire force, or be the second general in a row to, impugn the honor under the case of General Vance, which was an obvious scapegoat operation for the kind of adverse personal relationships that he had engaged in for his entire career. And, now we have General Iyer engaging in the same kind of careerism where, he's just kind of standing on the backs of his subordinates, of the entire force. And I saw a lot of this throughout my career. It's kind of, they come up with these big solutions, and it's kind of up to the rest of us to make them work. So I have a lot of words for General Iyer, and none of them good. But I get what you're saying here with the. There doesn't really seem to be a lot of practicing what we preach at the highest levels of the institution right now. Is that about right?
I would say so, for sure.
Okay, I'm sorry. I rant. This is what I do.
No, well, right on there with you, buddy.
Okay, right on. I'm going to see if we got another comment here, because I thought I saw a good one. Maybe I lost it. Whoa, here we go. Yeah, I wanted to throw this up because I know you're a philosophy guy here. Somebody's recommending a book for us. You know this one?
Oh yeah, the meditations should be recommended reading for, well, everybody in the military, but just folks in general. If you want some insight and worldly wisdom about how to navigate all of the trials and tribulations of life, this is a great resource that you can call upon.
Yeah, I would vehemently agree. I'm glad that somebody else out there is tracking this too, and it's coming to us through the comments. I think, anybody who's having a lot of trouble with their mental health right now is really struggling. Just read a page of wisdom every day with your coffee, even a couple of passages, and you'll feel better. Marcus Aurelius basically laid out the path to the good life for many of us in the West, or at least that's how he's been. That's what his legacy has been, and it's essentially his personal diary that he never really intended these thoughts for other human eyes. And what you will find when you read it is that, my struggles are his struggles, because he struggled with all the same kind of anxieties, and there's a lot in there about basically just the human condition and coping strategies to help you on your path in the good life. So I highly recommend the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius to anybody out there. I think I carry it with me everywhere I go and try to stay on top of it every day, make notes, journal, the whole shebang. And, it really helps. So that's one more reason why I say that what the world needs right now is more philosophy. But with that, I think I took up enough of the airtime for your introduction here, James, and I'll hand it back over to you for the final word. So take it away.
Well, thank you very much for having me on here, Jeff, and I'm looking forward to contributing more here with Veterans for Freedom, because as we all well know, there's a lot more important work to be done and issues to address. And if I could just end with this one last point that I think would likely be fodder for probably another entire show, in fact, just to make people aware of this as well. Something that should be deeply concerning, I believe, to everyone, especially around the issue in particular, the reason why I had to go into an early retirement along with hundreds of my fellow serving members, was the idea that even when the accommodation process began for CDS Directive 002, and I will be able to speak to this in a lot more depth in a future show perhaps, but it was already explicitly stated by those bad faith actors at the highest levels of our institutional power that if you're going to submit an accommodation request, at the very outset, they made it abundantly clear that no arguments from conscience were going to even be considered.
Yeah.
So we should all be deeply, deeply, gravely concerned that our highest level institutional leaders have, in a very broad strokes sort of way, admitted to all of us that your conscience and my conscience is irrelevant and frankly does not matter when it comes to something as serious as getting to decide what does or does not go into your body, the sanctity of that, and whether or not anybody has a right to choose.
Yeah, that's a great way to end it there, James. And I'll say, if you have a bunch of soldiers and veterans that are adverse to taking this, I mean, we do needle parades, and we're not exactly scared of needles. So you might want to ask why so many of us are concerned about this. But anyway, James, I really appreciate you coming on, man. It was a great presentation, and I'm looking forward to working with you on future projects for sure. Welcome to the team, and thanks for doing this with us.
Thank you very much.